Today, I'll tell you a shocking story about a serial killer whose victims were students and schoolgirls, the youngest of whom was just 11 years old. He would prepare food for himself and his mistress, and after his arrest, a squad of soldiers spent 3 days digging up human remains buried at his home. Alexei Sukletin was born in Kazan on March 23, 1943. The boy didn't have a father, so he was raised by his mother, who soon became a field nurse after giving birth to her son. Alexei's early years were spent in military hospitals, and it's possible that the images of wounded, mutilated, and suffering soldiers he witnessed may have had an impact on his psyche. Regardless, the cruelty in the future serial killer awakened early. At the age of 6, he strangled a kitten, and shortly thereafter, he killed a dog. He performed poorly in school, receiving mostly bad grades, and in his teenage years, he developed a fondness for alcohol that unleashed a beast within him. The young man lost control of himself. Alexei didn't fare well with girls, and in February 1960, he resorted to coercion. His victim was a resident of Kazan, whom the 16-year-old teenager stunned with a blow to the head and dragged into a snowdrift. Fortunately, 2 young men happened to pass by, noticed something amiss, and shouted at the attacker. But he didn't flee. Instead, he snapped back and advised the onlookers to mind their own business. In response, they subdued the unsuccessful criminal and, along with the victim, took him to the police. In court, Sukletin expressed remorse and wept bitterly alongside his mother, possibly leading to a relatively lenient sentence of 2 years in a correctional colony. He spent the first year in a juvenile facility and then moved to the adult zone. His criminal charge, despised by the inmates, brought him no good. He was ridiculed and tormented. Prison didn't reform the criminal. Upon release, he resumed drinking. In search of money for alcohol, the former inmate convinced 2 accomplices to rob an elderly woman. The trio posed as municipal service workers. As soon as the elderly woman, oblivious to the ruse, let them in, they struck her on the head and rendered her unconscious. The robbers stole 80 rubles from their victim, approximately $3, and immediately headed to the nearest pub. Meanwhile, the pensioner regained consciousness and called the police, who arrested the robbers on the same day. Thus, Alexei Sukletin found himself back behind bars. As a repeat offender, he received the longest sentence of all, 12 years of imprisonment. However, this time, from the beginning of his sentence, Sukletin began cooperating with the prison administration and informing on fellow inmates who violated the rules. Nevertheless, this did not help him secure early release on parole. He served his full sentence. In 1976, Sukletin returned to Kazan. Remarkably, at the age of 33, despite serving 2 prison terms, he managed to find a wife. He won the heart of his girlfriend with his erudition. While spending his days in prison, the convict filled gaps in his education and read almost every book available in the prison library. Life for the couple didn't go smoothly. The quick-tempered Alexei often mistreated his wife, raised his hand to her, and cheated on her. Eventually, he left her upon learning she was pregnant. After the divorce, Alexei moved to the village of Vasilyevo near Kazan and started looking for work. He briefly worked in a psychiatric hospital and then got a job as a security guard in the Kanlik gardening community. He lived there in a small guardhouse. Soon, he found a partner, 23-year-old Madina Shakarova, who initially worked as a lathe operator in a factory and later found employment at a rabbit farm. From her previous relationship, Madina had a young child who was raised by her parents. She was quite attractive but had insecurities due to her humble background, having a child, and lacking education. Consequently, her relationships with men hadn't been successful for a long time. Alexei Sukletin, well-read and affable despite his drinking habit, seemed like a decent match, and she moved in with him. Little did she know how nightmarish that decision would become. To start, their cohabitation led Sukletin to involve Shakarova in a criminal escapade. He convinced her to engage in blackmail along with his friend Renat Volkov. The roles were clearly defined. Madina would travel to Kazan, take a taxi to Vasilyevo, and complain to the driver about her husband's infidelity throughout the journey. Once they arrived in the village, she would invite the taxi driver to spend the evening together. However, when Shakarova and the driver found themselves in the bedroom, Sukletin and Volkov would burst in after a while. Sukletin would play the role of the enraged cuckolded husband, while Volkov posed as Medina's brother. Renat had a camera with him and pretended to photograph the taxi driver and Shakarova. After a massive scandal and physical violence, the perpetrators demanded 200 rubles, equivalent to a month's salary for a specialist in the late 1970s, threatening to expose the photos otherwise. Fearing public scrutiny and other consequences of their immoral behavior, the victims agreed and handed over the money. Over time, Sukletin began to rapidly deteriorate and lose his humanity. He chose Jack the Ripper as his idol, a notorious serial killer and cannibal, along with Jean-Bedel Bokassa, the dictator of the Central African Republic, and one day he decided to surpass them. In November 1979, at Kazan railway station, Sukletin met a 22-year-old woman named Ekaterina Osetrova. According to some reports, she was involved in prostitution. She agreed to go to the home of her new acquaintances, where Medina was already waiting for them. Medina knew about her lover's horrifying plan but didn't dare to oppose him. At some point, she distracted Osetrova by offering her a drink, while Sukletin approached the victim from behind, holding a hammer wrapped in cloth. He stunned the victim, then stabbed her and started drinking her blood. He ordered Shakarova to do the same. Afterward, the criminal dismembered the victim. Sukletin and Shakarova consumed some of the remains, fed another portion to their dog, and buried the victim's bones in their backyard. In early January 1980, the couple met two friends on the street and invited them to a New Year's gathering at their place. The friends agreed. After drinking heavily, the girls fell asleep, and the next morning, only one of them woke up. Sukletin spared her due to her music, but the 22-year-old Tatiana Illarionova suffered the same fate as Osetrova. After dismembering her body and hiding the parts in the refrigerator, Sukletin and Shakarova cleaned up the evidence. They told the awakened friend that Illarionova had left for Kazan in a hurry. The perplexed girls soon left the killer's hideout without realizing how lucky she was. Shakarova, seeing her off, acquired a tape recorder using Tatiana's passport. Sukletin turned out to be equally enterprising. He sold the victim's meat to residents of the gardening community, passing it off as local pork. Sukletin engaged in the meat trade on multiple occasions. Sometimes, Medina used the meat to make patties and other semi-prepared dishes, which the couple sold to unsuspecting neighbors. The next victim of the serial killer in February 1980 was a 15-year-old girl named Rizita Galimova. She was left to fend for herself as her mother had died, and her father was trapped in alcoholism. At some point, she decided to make a drastic change in her life. She moved to Kazan and enrolled in one of the local schools. However, she faced housing problems in the new city. It was then that her new acquaintance, Alexei Sukletin, promised to arrange for her to stay in a dormitory. But as soon as the student stepped into the maniac's residence, she realized it was a trap. Sukletin used the girl for his sexual purposes, and then he went for the hammer. Galimova begged Medina for help, but Shakarova had no intention of saving her. After Sukletin disposed of the student, Shakarova kept one of her sweaters for herself. She didn't hesitate to take the victim's clothing that she liked. And one day, this almost led to exposing the criminals. In March of the same year, 1980, Sukletin brought 20-year-old Nadezhda Sedianu to the house. According to one version, the girl appealed to the maniac, and he wanted to live with her. He simply decided to get rid of Medina Shakarova. Alexei even introduced Sedianu to his mother, who lived in Zelenodolsk, but the new relationship with the maniac didn't work out. In the end, Nadezhda lost her life, and her body was treated in the same way as the previous victims. Medina also started wearing Nadezhda's sweater. One day, a friend of the deceased saw Medina wearing it, and unfortunately, she visited the maniac. Perhaps the girl began to suspect what was happening, and the maniac realized it. Alexei dismembered her and ate her alongside his partner. Sukletin not only had no intention of stopping his atrocities, but seemed to be getting more deeply involved. In May 1980, the maniac noticed 11-year-old Valia Elikova on one of Kazan's streets. The girl was surprised when a stranger introduced himself as her relative and invited her to his place. But Alexei was so convincing, explaining how fate had separated them, that Valia eventually agreed to the stranger's proposal. When the maniac and the girl arrived at his house, Medina's nerves couldn't take it anymore. She tried to save the child, attacked Sukletin with her fists, but was beaten herself. According to some reports, the maniac disposed of Valia immediately. According to others, the girl lived in his lair for several days. Once, when Sukletin wasn't at home, Shakarova tried to take Valia to the train station and put her on a train, but the maniac intercepted them along the way and carried out his terrible plan to the end. After taking Valia's life, Sukletin ordered his partner to find and abduct a 6-month-old victim, but instead, Medina packed her belongings and fled to her parents. The maniac didn't grieve for long and soon lured the daughter of his acquaintance to his home, promising the girl that he would introduce her to his nephew from Italy. However, Sukletin didn't take the girl's life. He used her for his sexual purposes and let her go, threatening her with harm if she ever told anyone about what had happened. Soon after this incident, Alexei acquired a new lover, 23-year-old Lydia Fyodorova. Just like Medina, he planned to make her an accomplice and openly told her about his fascination, hoping for her approval. At the same time, the maniac tried to portray himself as a sanitation worker, ridding society of antisocial elements. Fyodorova didn't have strict moral principles and became his lover, but she adamantly refused to assist the maniac and later resorted to blackmail. On March 12, 1985, during a feast, Fyodorova once again threatened Sukletin by saying she would inform the police about everything, and the maniac cold-bloodedly took her life. Unexpectedly, his accomplice in this act was Anatoly Nikitin, a relative of Lydia Fyodorova, who was also sitting at the table. Nikitin helped the maniac with dismemberment, after which the accomplices dined on the same meat and buried the bones in the yard. Lydia Fyodorova's blood in the cannibal's residence helped Medina clean up. By that time, she had returned to Alexei, never having found her place in her parents' home, while the maniac, after his final crime, descended into alcoholism. Meanwhile, investigators began searching for Fyodorova, whose relatives had reported her missing. Interestingly, most of Alexei's victims, except for Galimova and Valia Elikova, were never actively sought by the police. The women, having fallen victim to the maniac, led an antisocial lifestyle and often disappeared for extended periods. However, the search for Lydia Fyodorova was treated with utmost seriousness by the investigators. They learned that shortly before her disappearance, the young woman had moved in with Sukletin. Soon, the police paid a visit to the maniac with questions. However, barely able to stand on his feet, Sukletin struggled to explain to the uninvited guests that Fyodorova had indeed been there, but had left after a recent argument, and he had no idea where she had gone. After a cursory inspection of the maniac's residence, the investigators found nothing suspicious and left. A couple of months later, in June 1985, Sukletin's friend Gennady Uglov came to help him with a roof repair, having heard about Fyodorova's disappearance. After downing a shot, Uglov asked if Sukletin could help him avoid the notices for loafing, falsely indicating in his work record that Gennady was employed at the Gardening Association. Then, he inquired about the missing girl. Convinced that Uglov depended on him and wouldn't report to the police, the maniac confessed and told him everything. At the end of his confession, Sukletin pointed to a barrel of water in the yard, implying that Uglov should take a look. Uglov reached into the barrel and, to his horror, found human remains. After parting ways with the maniac, Gennady rushed to the police. Initially, the law enforcement officers dismissed his account as the ramblings of a drunken man. However, they eventually decided to revisit the maniac for a re-examination. In the maniac's residence, the police found him as usual, intoxicated and barely standing. In the barrel, they indeed discovered the remains. Forensic experts later identified the victims using surgical plates inserted shortly before their deaths. In the vertebral bones, they found these plates. The maniac explained that he didn't kill one of the women because her meat smelled of medication. Medical examiners also noted that the maniac skillfully dismembered his victims using a knife. He was well acquainted with joint locations and never used an axe, unlike a butcher. In the meantime, the efforts of neighbors to assist the investigators were of no avail. All of them, without exception, spoke highly of Alexei Sukletin as an upright and intelligent individual who was always ready to engage in conversations on various topics and lend a helping hand, whether it was digging potatoes, fixing plumbing, or treating them to meat and kebabs. However, one resident of the community remembered something peculiar. She was always puzzled by how Sukletin referred to the guys as cutlets. Nevertheless, investigators managed to extract some valuable information from witness testimonies. It turned out that during the entire time the maniac lived in Kinlyken, approximately 20 women had visited him. After the criminal's arrest, local residents burned down the cannibal's lair to the ground and turned it into a landfill. When Alexei was brought to the police station, he was immediately dubbed the Kazan Alligator by the public. He didn't deny that he was responsible for Lydia Fyodorova's death, but initially, he attempted to distance himself from the other victims. The maniac only started talking when presented with irrefutable evidence. With a calm smirk, the executioner recounted to the investigators how he took lives and consumed human flesh, consistently adhering to his version of cleansing society of antisocial elements. Supposedly, the maniac explained that he hadn't planned on eating that meat. The first time, he cooked it to feed his dog, but because he was drunk, he decided to taste it himself. The maniac struck a deal with the investigators to receive cigarettes, tea, and 50 rubles for each victim he disclosed. Sukletin received his compensation 6 times, but on the 7th occasion, they refused to pay him after his revelations. This caused him to harbor resentment, and for several days, he refused to leave his cell and insulted anyone who approached him. Simultaneously, Medina, who had been apprehended, was giving her testimony. She cried, trembled, and claimed that she hadn't participated in the crimes, but had merely served as a cook. From her statements,
I never took anyone's life myself, although I admit that I was an accomplice. Afterward, I diligently cleaned the house to hide the traces.
she portrayed her cohabitant as a cruel and dangerous individual, attempting to persuade the investigators that the maniac had forced her into becoming an accomplice through threats. Despite her heartfelt remorse, the prosecution initially sought the death penalty for her, but her 100 pages of heartfelt confession and assistance during the investigation made an impact. Medina was sentenced to 15 years of strict regime imprisonment. Life in prison was far from easy for her. Her fellow inmates, who nicknamed the detainee Dina and the meat grinder, declared a veritable war against the woman. Some provoked fights, while others initiated a boycott, categorically refusing to be in the same room as her. Medina was transferred from one correctional facility to another several times, but each time, she was met with the same warm reception. Serving her sentence to the end, Medina eventually returned to the village of Vasilyevo near Kazan.
Did I really do this of my own free will? But think about it for a moment. This is my homeland. I grew up in a normal family.
She justified herself after her release. Alexei Sukletin personally crafted women's shoes out of bread crumbs while he was in detention and gave them to the investigator, Farid Zajadelin, as a gift. As for the Kazan Alligator himself, the investigation managed to prove his involvement in 7 brutal killings, and despite his numerous psychological abnormalities, he was deemed sane. During a psychiatric evaluation, when asked by the doctor if he was afraid of a terrible fate, the executioner replied, "Why should I fear God? I am my own God and devil. I don't fear death at all. I'm not ready to die just yet. I haven't lived long enough." Alexei's sentenced death by firing squad didn't surprise anyone, including the maniac himself. So, the cunning criminal devised a plan to prolong his life. He started claiming that he had taken lives and eaten beyond the borders of Tatarstan. However, law enforcement quickly saw through this ploy. A few inquiries in the city Sukletin had mentioned revealed that he was lying. Alexei Sukletin was executed in July 1987, according to some reports, or in 1994, according to others. In the final days of his life, he was engaged in handicrafts, crafting small women's shoes out of breadcrumbs, which he presented as gifts to prison staff. One correctional officer even kept a photo card of Sukletin with his signature as a memento of my first encounter with the cannibal.